really, really well here as well. So it's like you see the next generation, the young generation hyping up the tennis world.
Part is she's coming here in a very different position than she came last year. Class, so much grace, and she's fun to watch. I think there are a couple of things she needs to continue to improve and get.
Like Alex Eala, Joao Fonseca, seeing the Filipino fans, the Brazilian.
The WTA had weathered its share of storms before. Doping controversies, exhausting equal pay battles, walkouts, boycotts, and the kind of internal friction most organizations quietly bury beneath polished statements and sponsor dinners. But this felt different. Not 3 sponsors, not all within a single day, and certainly not on the very afternoon that Alex Eala, the most talked-about young talent in women's tennis, was suddenly and coldly pushed aside with little to no explanation. In just 24 hours, shockwaves traveled from Manila to Miami. Executives rushed into emergency calls. PR teams scrambled to craft statements faster than they could approve them. And the WTA's official social media accounts went eerily silent for 6 hours, right when the online world was at its loudest. Because when 3 major financial backers walk away at the exact moment you sideline a rising star from a nation of over 110 million passionate fans, silence isn't protection, it's exposure. The silence became the confession. It marked the moment the WTA lost control of its own story. And at the center of it all stood a player who never once raised her voice. She was the kind of competitor fans couldn't help but fall for. Not because of what she said, but because of how she carried herself. To understand what truly unfolded that day, you have to look at what Alex Eala had become in the months leading up to it. She wasn't just a compelling story. She was the story. A young Filipino talent shaped at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca. She had battled through junior Grand Slams, the grind of ITF circuits, and the brutal early qualifying rounds that most casual fans never even notice. Nothing about her rise was handed to her. There was no powerful federation lifting her up, no inherited prestige, just raw talent and a level of discipline that felt almost intimidating for someone so young. And slowly, the results began to reflect the growing belief. Wins started stacking up. Rankings climbed. And with every victory, the buzz grew louder. From locker rooms to tennis Twitter to the media circles that decide who becomes a star and who fades away. The Philippines was watching. Southeast Asia was watching. And the world was starting to pay attention. And this was something the WTA understood better than anyone. Southeast Asia represents one of the fastest-growing tennis markets in the world. From broadcast deals to streaming numbers to merchandise sales, the business case for investing in a Filipino star wasn't just strong, it was obvious by nearly every metric. So when the WTA announced a major promotional event, a high-visibility, heavily marketed showcase designed to highlight the next generation of women's tennis, Alex Eala's name was everywhere, not just among fans but across the entire industry. Writers were already drafting feature pieces. Brands were quietly negotiating image rights, and television producers were building entire broadcast angles around her expected presence. No one was asking if she would be included. The assumption was that she would be the centerpiece, which is why what happened next didn't just disappoint or confuse people. It ignited outrage. The WTA didn't just leave Alex Eala off the list. They did it without explanation, without comment, and without even the most basic acknowledgement of her presence. A decision made behind closed doors, likely by executives who underestimated the scale of the moment, quickly spiraled into one of the most costly miscalculations in recent WTA history. With over 1 billion fans engaging with their content worldwide, the stakes were already enormous. And when the announcement finally went public on a Tuesday morning, revealing the carefully selected lineup for their premier showcase event, it became instantly clear that something was very, very wrong. The organization had carefully chosen the players it believed would represent the future of women's tennis on a global stage, and this was no small moment. The event carried major broadcast partnerships, a presenting sponsor, and fully launched social media campaigns. It was more than just another tournament. It was a statement, a calculated declaration by the WTA about who truly mattered in the sport's next era. And yet, Alex Eala's name was nowhere to be seen at first. The reaction was simple confusion. Fans, especially those who closely followed rankings and WTA metrics, assumed it had to be a mistake. Maybe a formatting error or an accidental omission during editing. Surely it would be corrected within the hour, but it wasn't. Hours passed, and the WTA remained silent. That silence began to reshape the mood. Confusion gave way to frustration, and frustration quickly turned into anger. Because what made this omission so hard to defend wasn't just Alex Eala's popularity. It was the fact that by nearly every competitive measure, she clearly belonged in that lineup. Her rankings supported it. Her recent performances proved it. And her rapid upward trajectory, the very kind of momentum these showcases are meant to highlight, made her exclusion feel not just questionable but impossible to explain. She wasn't there, even as players ranked below her made the cut. When a reporter pressed a WTA spokesperson for clarity, the response felt like a textbook case of corporate deflection. They pointed vaguely to selection criteria, mentioned that the field had been finalized based on a mix of factors, and expressed pride in the event's lineup and excitement for the week ahead. But there was no mention of her, not even a basic acknowledgement that her absence was the very reason the question was being asked. That was the breaking point. The Filipino tennis community, patient, passionate, and unwavering through years of watching one of its own fight for recognition, reached its limit. Because there is a clear difference between being overlooked and being erased. And what the WTA had done, whether intentional or not, felt much closer to the latter. By late afternoon on the day of the announcement, something extraordinary began to unfold. What followed was almost unheard of in the tightly controlled world of professional sports sponsorship. Within hours, 3 major WTA corporate partners released statements, separate, not officially coordinated, yet strikingly aligned in tone. The first came from a global sportswear brand that had supported the WTA for over a decade. Its message was measured and diplomatic, stating that it was reassessing partnership priorities and seeking alignment with organizations that reflected its commitment to global representation and inclusion. The second, a major financial services company and one of the WTA's most lucrative newer partners, was more direct. It expressed deep concern over the organization's approach to diversity in its promotional decisions, noting that these issues had been raised privately before, and announced an immediate pause on its partnership pending review. Then came the statement that truly ignited the news cycle. A lifestyle brand with one of the largest social media followings in sports sponsorship chose not to release a formal statement, but instead posted publicly that it could no longer align itself with an organization that, in its words, consistently failed to reflect the diversity of the sport's rapidly growing global fan base. Alex Eala's name was never mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Everyone understood exactly what it meant. 3 sponsors. 3 exits. All within a single afternoon. Inside the WTA, the reaction was immediate and frantic. Reports suggested the communications team shifted into full crisis mode within minutes. Internal calls overlapped, legal advisors were pulled in, and senior executives quietly canceled scheduled media appearances for later that evening as the situation spiraled beyond their control. Without explanation, appearances disappeared, and on social media, the arena where modern sports crises are truly decided, the story was moving faster than any PR team could contain. What made the sponsors' response so damaging wasn't just the financial impact, though that alone was significant. It was the timing. 3 separate companies, likely without formal coordination, all arriving at the same conclusion on the same day. To the outside world, that sent a powerful message. This wasn't a sudden shock inside the industry. It was a breaking point, the moment when pressure that had been building behind the scenes finally spilled into the open. And if you were online that evening, you watched it unfold in real time. Hashtags surged across the Philippines, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Journalists who rarely weighed in on WTA decisions suddenly had strong opinions. Former players, many with first-hand experience navigating the organization's long and complicated relationship with race, representation, and marketability, began speaking out in ways that felt long overdue. And across platforms, across languages, from fans who had never interacted before, the same question kept appearing. Why does she have to fight this hard just to be seen? That was what made Alex Eala's situation resonate so deeply. She hadn't created controversy. She hadn't made demands or chased headlines with bold statements. She had simply done the work, quietly, consistently, in exactly the way the sport claims to reward, and still found herself shut out of an opportunity that should have been hers. The backlash, then, wasn't just about a single omission. It was about everything that omission seemed to represent. Tennis has always carried a complicated past, especially for players of color, athletes from non-traditional tennis nations, and those who don't fit the narrow mold long favored by European and North American institutions. Alex Eala's situation didn't just raise eyebrows, it cracked open a conversation the W had quietly tried to contain. It forced people to question who gets promoted, who receives feature coverage, who is given the spotlight, and why some players are still told to wait their turn even after they've already earned it. Accusations of racial and geographic bias spread quickly online. Some were measured, coming from longtime observers of the sport who had years of examples behind them. Others were more emotional, driven by fans who simply couldn't understand how an organization that presents itself as a champion of women's tennis could fail to fully stand behind a player like Alex Eala. And through all of it, the trending hashtags, public statements, opinion pieces, viral threads, and sports shows fueling the debate, the WTA said nothing. That silence, in the middle of a fast-growing global conversation, may have been the single biggest strategic mistake they made in an already chaotic week. Because in a crisis, silence doesn't feel like composure. It feels like guilt. And here's what no one in the official tennis world was willing to say out loud, even though it was being said privately everywhere. The WTA's relationship with emerging markets has often felt uneven. The organization embraces the viewership, the broadcast growth, and the sponsorship revenue those regions bring. But when it comes to elevating the players who represent those audiences, the faces and stories that would make that relationship truly mutual, the enthusiasm becomes far more selective. Sources close to the situation pointed to a recurring pattern in the WTA's internal decisions. A steady preference for players from established tennis markets when it came to promotion. Not occasionally, consistently. From showcase events to marketing campaigns and high-visibility opportunities, the same patterns kept appearing. Once you noticed them, they were hard to ignore and even harder to forget. Alex wasn't the first player from a non-traditional tennis nation to find herself on the wrong side of those decisions. She was simply the one it happened to at a moment when global attention was already locked in, when sponsors had reached their limit, and when social media made it impossible to contain or control the narrative. Leaked internal discussions, which the WTA neither confirmed nor denied, pointed to conversations about the showcase lineup that downplayed competitive rankings and recent performance as primary factors. Instead, the focus shifted to brand alignment, existing media relationships, and established audience familiarity. In the world of corporate sports promotion, that language carries a clear meaning. Decisions were being made based on who was already known, who felt safe and familiar, rather than who had earned the moment through merit. In a sport that prides itself on meritocracy, in an organization that presents itself as a global advocate for women, that is impossible to defend. Not in 2026, and certainly not with over 110 million Filipinos watching closely to see how the story would unfold. 3 days after it all broke, Alex Eala finally spoke. Not in a press conference, not through a carefully managed statement, but through a quiet post on her personal social media. In her own words, she thanked her supporters, reaffirmed that she would continue to train, compete, and believe in the sport she had loved since childhood. She expressed pride in her journey, and without bitterness or forced calm, the kind that takes real restraint, she made it clear she would let her tennis speak for itself. That was all. No accusations, no anger, no demands for apologies, just a young woman from Manila reminding the world with quiet and devastating clarity that she was still here, unbroken, and that the court, not the corporate boardroom, would ultimately tell her story. Boardrooms, not showcase lineups or sponsor announcements, would never define her answer. And the response was overwhelming. Within hours, her post had been shared millions of times, not because it was explosive, but precisely because it wasn't. In a week dominated by corporate statements, damage control, and institutional deflection, a 20-something athlete from the Philippines had said something that felt more real than anything the surrounding organization had managed to deliver. Eventually, the WTA released a full statement. It acknowledged partner and fan concerns about representation in promotional events, committed to reviewing selection criteria, and outlined several diversity-related initiatives. The statement was detailed and carefully written, but it arrived nearly 72 hours too late. By the time it landed, most of the people it was meant to reach had already moved on, not because they had forgiven the organization, but because they had found someone far more deserving of their attention, Alex. Tennis history is filled with players who were overlooked. Some allowed it to consume them. Some used it as motivation. And some, like Alex, simply kept playing, quietly reshaping the narrative and reminding the world that merit, resilience, and authenticity cannot be silenced. Some quietly disappeared. And some, the ones we remember, whose names still echo long after they've left the tour, turned every closed door into the strength to break through the next one. The WTA may have believed they were handling a simple lineup decision. What they actually created was a defining moment, a before and after, a line in the sand that an entire country of tennis fans and a generation of players watching from the sidelines will look back on for years in the end. The sponsors returned. Statements were eventually made, hashtags faded, and the news cycle moved on, as it always does. But Alex Eala didn't stop. She kept training. She kept winning. And every match she played after that week carried an added weight, not just her own ambition, but the shared ambition of every player who had ever been told they weren't quite right for the stage they had clearly earned. Was this simply a case of organizational oversight? Was it something deeper? A reflection of systemic patterns the WTA's crisis revealed rather than created? Or was it the moment that finally made it impossible for the sport to keep ignoring a conversation it had avoided for far too long? The answer isn't simple, and this conversation is far from over.